My name is Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together, and I'll be presenting today's presentation in relation to COVID. We have a few hundred people online, so we will be trying to get through the presentation to cover most of the questions that people provided beforehand. I'll also try and see if I can get that off screen. So, my name's Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary. Before we start today, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we're meeting in across the state and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In terms of today's presentation, what we are looking at providing is a presentation for members within core government departments in relation to COVID. There are some of our members in schools, corrections and other areas in Queensland Health that have already been covered by mandates. So the information today is designed for those areas in government departments who aren't currently subject to CHO mandates. In terms of what we know, in terms of in a broader sense, is that we know that the Queensland borders have come down earlier this week, and we've also seen a strong emergence in relation to internationally of a new strain of COVID in terms of Omicron. So I think while we have some understanding of the modelling, that will mean that we'll have more COVID in 2022 in Queensland than we had in 2021. I think there are still very significant questions that are yet to be answered as to what we are going to be facing as we move forward. But in terms of that process, one of the key issues that clearly is on the agenda is in relation to the potential for public servants to be required as part of their employment to be vaccinated. So in terms of that process, what we are clearly seeking to do as part from Together's point of view is to deal with the issue of whether to mandate or not. But also what we do also know is that the mandate issue deals with a small percentage of the workforce. We know in Queensland the vaccination rates are high and continuing to increase. We also know from previous advice from our membership that Together membership is higher vaccinated than the general population. But also, while mandates are a very significant question that are being considered by the Chief Health Officer and by employers in the Queensland public sector, mandates are not going to be the solution alone in relation to the pandemic. Irrespective of whether the population is vaccinated, there still will be COVID in Queensland. The vaccinations will hopefully mean people are less likely to get very sick from COVID and are less likely to spread it to others. But irrespective of whether we have a mandated workplace or not, we are still going to see very significant levels potentially of COVID within our workplaces during 2022. And we are going to have to address what the implications are of COVID for our membership on a workplace by workplace basis, and looking at what it provides, how we then move towards having safer workplaces for everybody, as well as the issue in relation to mandates. But even after that mandate decision is or isn't made in a workplace, there will continue to be decisions that need to be made by workers and by their employer over the weeks and months ahead if the modelling is true in relation to the future of COVID in Queensland, and particularly if Omicron is as fast spreading as the initial advice appears to be in relation to both the experience in New South Wales, but more frighteningly, the experience in relation to particularly the UK in relation to the spread. Before we talk about the broader strategy from a workplace health and safety point of view in relation to COVID, we also want to kind of talk through where we're at with mandates. And at this point in time, what we do know is that that there is the potential for mandates to occur where, as part of your requirement for your employment, only people who are vaccinated will be able to be employed. In terms of how those mandates are achieved, they can either be achieved through a health directive issued by the Chief Health Officer, or they can be issued by the employer, and that the employer can make a requirement that if you want to continue to work for that employer, you have to be vaccinated. In terms of that process in the Queensland public sector, it's been different in other states. But in Queensland, what we've seen is that initially in the public sector, there were two major employers that chose to introduce mandates for vaccination. That was within Queensland Health and the Queensland Police Service. Queensland Health is a bit confusing in this area because originally it was an employer mandate. Subsequent to that, there's been a CHO mandate that overlaps with the employer mandate, but most of the material that you will have seen in the Courier Mail and the various court cases that are ongoing are applying to the original employer mandate. And certainly in terms of Queensland Police, it was a decision of the Police Commissioner herself, rather than the Chief Health Officer, that required police staff and police sworn officers to be vaccinated in relation to their continued employment in the police service. Since those two initial mandates were announced a few months ago, we've then seen that the Chief Health Officer has started to mandate for particular employers and particular work sites. The first of those CHO mandates was in relation to the health system, both public and private, and that had less impact on us together, in that our majority of our membership in Queensland Health was already covered by the employer mandate, but that mandate reached into the public service in relation to disability services. So AS&RS, the disability service section of the department, is now covered by a CHO mandate that followed the mandates that occurred at an employer level in police and health. Subsequent to that, there were some announcements in relation to CHO mandates that took a fair amount of time to be actually issued. So we had 2 or 3 weeks after an announcement made by the Chief Health Officer, but before a final actual legal enforcement of a CHO decision was made. And they related to Queensland Corrections, schools, and also art gallery, museum, and some of the state library areas. And so those CHO mandates are quite recent. They apply from the 17th of December, but because they were so delayed in the actual implementation of them, as opposed to the announcement of them, there is effectively a 1-month period when, after the CHO mandate was announced for the 17th of December, there's a 1-month period where there will still be the ability for workers to perform work, particularly within Queensland Corrections, without being vaccinated and giving that 1-month time frame. That is still a ridiculously short amount of time compared to the time that workers within Queensland Health and the Queensland Police Service were able to get vaccinated. So in terms of corrections and schools, it was originally said that they had to be vaccinated by the 1st of December, 17th of December, to be able to go to work. That's now been said that they've got to 17th December plus 1 month. And during that 1-month period, they'll have to be rapid testing done in relation to, or testing done in relation to workers in youth detention, corrections, and in relation to schools. More recently, and those CHO announcements and decisions were made as kind of just on Sunday, so they've only been in place for 4 or 5 days. But what we're now also seeing is that employers are considering mandating beyond the CHO mandate, as people who don't work in schools but visit schools as part of their work, and don't work in the art gallery or museum or state library but perform work as part of their duties, going to those art galleries, etc. And also those people who don't work in youth detention but go to youth detention centres as part of their duties, are starting to be having employer mandates applied to them. So in youth detention, all workers are mandated to be under the CHO direction with a 1-month delay, 1-month kind of transitional period. But also the department is now saying for child safety officers who have to visit a youth detention centre, they will have to be vaccinated if they're visiting youth detention centres. So there is a ripple effect of employer mandates in response to the CHO mandates. That's also going to have some implications for us in relation to liquor licensing and a range of other areas where people's work isn't mandated, but where they work, where they have to visit as part of their work is likely to be being considered. What we also know in terms of this process is that the ability of the employer to mandate is being upheld by the courts. So we've seen that decision initially in the Industrial Court in Queensland in relation to the Police Service and Queensland Health, where the full bench of the Industrial Commission, sitting as the Industrial Court, determined that it was able to, that the employer was lawfully able to mandate. We then subsequently have seen some Supreme Court action in relation to a judicial review in relation to particularly the police service. That initial decision of the Supreme Court was that they would only hear the matter in relation to the non-issues in relation to outside of the Industrial Commission powers. There was a decision by the appeal court in the last couple of days, which says the Supreme Court should actually hear the whole case in relation to all matters, and not say that those things which were previously determined by the Industrial Court were outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in relation to the judicial review. So the Industrial Court has determined it was legal for the decision to be made under the Industrial Relations Act and those powers. The Supreme Court is now going to reconsider a judicial review under different set of powers as to whether that matter was an appropriate decision to make. So the first one was really about does the employer have the ability to make the decision? Second one was the right decision made? So that second Supreme Court matter was going to be heard over the next couple of days. That because of the initial decision by the appeals court to go back to a fuller jurisdiction, that's now going to be heard in February. And then we also saw the full bench of the Fair Work Commission in the federal jurisdiction say that the decision in relation to a particular mine down south, that was overturned, not on the basis that the employer didn't have the ability to make the decision. That was certainly recognised, but the decision in relation to the mines failed because of inappropriate consultation. So while the Fair Work Commission quite clearly said the employer can mandate, the ability to mandate is based on doing due process in relation to consultation, and as a result, BHP and in relation to those mines is now going to go back and have to reconsider that matter with appropriate consultation with staff and union members in relation to what that looks like whether the decision was right. They still have the ability to do it, but they have to do consultation. So in terms of the broader framework of the borders coming down, plus the emergence of Omicron, and effectively what we kind of interpret from what the CHO has decided is that the CHO has now decided where they're going to mandate. And they've mandated in hospitals, both public and private. They've mandated in schools, detention centres, youth detention centres, and corrections. But there doesn't appear to be any likelihood that the CHO will be mandating beyond that in relation to the vaccinations within the public sector. It doesn't mean the employer may not, and certainly the employer is considering in most government agencies whether or not to mandate all or part of their departments. But we can now assume that in terms of those decisions moving forward, that certainly in the medium term, future vaccination mandates are going to be employer related in the public sector rather than CHO mandated. So from a union perspective, what we've been saying broadly to government is that the problem we've been having up till now has been a failure to consult. And while there isn't a requirement to consult around the CHO mandates in terms of what's happened in terms of schools and in terms of corrections, we saw reasonable consultation in relation to police and in relation to the Queensland Health employer mandate. But what we also want to make sure is we're having a conversation about what is safe for our workplaces for 2022, not just about whether the employer wants to mandate, but if the modelling is correct and if Omicron appears to be as virulent as it is, what are the choices that are going to happen in relation to keeping our workplaces safe? And how do we avoid some of the challenges in terms of the train wreck around the way it's being handled in corrections and in schools because of rushed decisions? And while those decisions were caused, the rush was caused by the CHO delay and then very artificial timeframe saying that we had literally 5 days between the CHO decision and the start of the mandating corrections in schools, and then trying to do a mandate during the school holidays. What we need to know in terms of that process is that we want quality decisions to be made and we want them to be evidence-based, and certainly that was the survey results that came out of from the members across government departments over the last couple of weeks. But that consultation shouldn't be rushed and that we should have a real opportunity for workers to have a say and a voice in terms of that process, and also that those processes need to reflect the rights of individuals during this process, particularly in relation to where mandates are being considered and where exemptions are being considered, because our members in corrections are literally having days to try and apply for an exemption process, rather than in the police and health, there was the process was much more staggered, and there was a much more reasonable approach in relation to the ability for workers to seek exceptions during that process. So what we've been saying to government out of that survey process was that we really needed some sort of roadmap for the future. We've seen roadmaps for the unlocking process, and as we've come out of the first phase of the pandemic, the government was quite detailed in terms of the roadmaps. And this is the one that they had in relation to the unlocking process. What we put to government in terms of this process out of that survey is that we need to be starting to develop a roadmap for the future in terms of dealing with the fact that we have a series of unknown events that are going to occur, but we know that they are likely to occur. We don't know when and exactly how, but doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about it earlier. And we have the opportunity, given the way that the borders have come down, and hopefully, despite the fact that Omicron is quite virulent, we'll have some opportunity to actually have a decent conversation with government between the employer and union members about how do we keep our workplaces safe during 2022, and thinking through this process that irrespective of the mandate choice, we would be seeking that there be regular engagement with government, because when we know that irrespective of whether mandates are introduced or not, there will still be COVID in the public sector workplaces at some point in 2022. We don't know which building, we don't know how many, but it is almost inevitable that we will have COVID cases occurring in our workplaces, but definitely within our communities. And we should be planning for that eventuality now and talking about the workplace health and safety responses now. And really thinking through, while we don't know how the roadmap will go, we do know some of the likely events. We want to have that evidence-based decision-making rather than rush decision-making, and thinking about the options for the future before they occur. So when we do have a significant outbreak in a particular workplace or in a particular community, rather than starting from scratch in terms of the responses, that those responses have been well developed and thought through, and then we're choosing from a range of options. And in terms of that kind of traffic light option within a broader roadmap, having it evidence-based, trying to have agencies thinking about it in advance, but also trying to have the agencies thinking about it together in terms of that process. So if something hits in one particular building, whether it's 111 George or Rockhampton Government Centre, State Government Centre, that the agencies pick and choose from existing pre-developed choices about how do they respond to those new circumstances. And they consult with staff and union members before, when they're developing the options for the future, rather than rush decision-making once we get a crisis. Because we don't know the scale of the crisis, but there will be a crisis during 2022 of some level and some description in relation to COVID that will touch our workplaces. And there is a requirement that they consult with us. We want to make sure that by controlling the agenda and the timeframes around that, we can force meaningful consultation. Because certainly in terms of the processes up till now, we would have to be saying that there has been limited processes that we would say that have been particularly helpful in this regard, and we haven't seen the same level in terms of that process. So what we are keen to get feedback from members across during this process is whether or not you feel that there has been appropriate communication in your workplace, and whether you believe the employer has been able to keep you informed in relation to what's going on. So certainly in terms of what the feedback we've had as part of that survey that we did a couple of weeks ago was that there wasn't adequate communication. We're certainly seeing, based on the results coming through right now, that it has been quite diverse in terms of agency by agency process. So in terms of that process, what we are seeing is that we want to then try and build a way forward, and also that in terms of the way that these decisions are made, that we should have some consistency across the sector. That while individual departments have been thinking about some of these issues, some departments have been talking to staff, others haven't, that there should be some consistency of approach, particularly as how staff are treated, in terms of if there is how departments make the choice about mandate, if they do mandate, how staff are treated, and then if in terms of them processes, also about some supports around those processes. So what that looked like in terms of a specific process is then the trying to think through, at an agency level, also what are some of the choices that need to be considered by workers and by employers at an agency level. And so we've sought that there needs to be regular meetings set up in advance. So rather than having meetings called because of a crisis, we have regularly scheduled meetings where delegates can meet with the employer. And we had one of those just this morning in relation to Cheddar, but also seeking that there is some timeliness in relation to decision making, because certainly the experience in relation up to now has been that the employer decisions have been rushed, partly because of the decisions by the CHO, but also that the fact that while government has been thinking about this a lot, they haven't been talking to staff and there hasn't been a process. So one of the things that we came out of that survey was asking that the employer starts to actually get vaccination status. In terms of that process, we're saying it should be voluntary, but in terms of seeking evidence-based decisions, clearly the level of vaccinations within an agency does have a significant impact in relation to the workplace health and safety for all workers in that agency, but all workers in that work site. So trying to get the government and departments to actually ask is a step forward in communicating that process and making sure there's due privacy controls within that process, but also that they actually do talk to people rather than being fearful of asking the conversation, and so therefore trying to make decisions in a blind way. Secondly, seeking that there is real meaningful consultation about if they're going to consider mandates. So the CHO ones have already come in, but clearly departments need to be considering whether or not whether to go further than that, and whether mandates should go further, that we're by an employer mandate. So I think in terms of that, what we've put to government departments is the 23rd of January as a deadline, just to force a decision, because there was lots of stuff going on, but no actual engagement with workers around that. So we wrote to Directors General who aren't CHO mandated earlier this week saying, we want a deadline of a 23rd for you to give us a decision for consultation. That isn't to say that a mandate should come in on the 23rd, but is actually then requiring that there be some process whereby that there is actually a conversation with workers, but also that they actually have a timeliness of it, rather than leaving it to a crisis if Omicron and the COVID picks up, but going to actually having a deadline for them to have a conversation with us. And then in terms of those processes, also then thinking through, from our point of view, going to the next poll. What we surveyed members in relation to the whether that there should be a requirement in terms of the requirement for mandating within workplaces. And what we've seen in that survey was that it's quite a divisive issue, and that in terms of the overall outcomes, we saw in terms of the survey about 2-to-1 splits between workers and union members across the public service who haven't been already mandated in relation to COVID. So what we'd be suggesting and what we're wanting to get kind of feedback from members today is whether we do a formal poll agency by agency to give members a clear view that when we go to the employer, that we are able to speak on behalf of members in terms of that process. So in terms of what that looks like, we are seeing kind of continuing general support for that process. We don't know, particularly in terms of the survey results, what they look like in terms of that process specifically. So we would be wanting to go forward from today with a process of polling members, and what we probably want to do within that time frame would be to say that we have a decision by the 23rd of January for union members to give direction for the union broadly as to what they think for their agency. So in terms of that process, what we would then, and there's kind of from today, that kind of shows reasonably strong support for that there should be a union ballot by agency, and we'll do that moving forward. And what that would then mean is that we'll be asking the departments to have a decision by the 23rd, whether they would like to mandate or not. But also then, but from within the union context, we would have a direction from union members, agency by agency, about what our response might look like. And then seeking then from an employer point of view, decent consultation during February around a decision to mandate or not, but then also saying that if there is going to be a mandate brought in for any part of their agency, that mandate doesn't, that people have till the end of February to seek an exemption to reverse the challenges faced by our members in corrections and schools about unrealistic deadlines. So having a 1 March deadline for exemption of applications. And then if people are then going from that process, that we have a decision about an exemption, and clearly, and then if there are going to be HR decisions or disciplinary decisions which are occurring in other agencies in terms of suspensions or whatever, that they would be then occurring not before the 1st of March. So we would have consultation about government to think about what they think about in the mandate during January, union members to think about what they think about a mandate during January, have a discussion at the departmental level in late January, early February, and that might be that union members are demanding a mandate or might not be, but then also have a staggered and non-rushed process for exemption, because those exemptions, if they're employer decisions, would potentially be broader exceptions than are available under the CHO mandates for schools and corrections. So in terms of exceptions, there is little ability for the Education Queensland to change what exceptions look like for schools, but there was a much greater capacity within the Queensland Police Service for exceptions because they're employer driven. So in terms of that process, seeking that process, but also in that particularly then ensuring that the union has the ability to protect the rights of individuals during this exercise. So clearly there has been and continues to be issues in relation to suspensions for people who work in areas which are subject to mandates, and there is now a point of significant disputation between the union and the employer about whether you can be suspended without pay. So initially in health and in police, the suspension was with pay. They're now threatening suspension without pay to try and force people to get vaccinated, and that is likely to be the case. In all likelihood, we think is where they're going to get to in corrections. So we're likely to be taking significant industrial work through the Industrial Commission and potentially through some injunctions and whatever to try and make sure that we can protect that processes, but also make sure that the suspension without pay isn't abused to try and force vaccinations for people who are going through that process. But clearly, one of the likely potential outcomes is whether it's suspension without pay or with pay. Termination is certainly on the books as a potential outcome for those areas which are fully mandated. And then from the union perspective, what we are also then wanting to see is how we are able to proactively deal with COVID moving forward. And in terms of that process, what we are wanting to do is make sure that we have a strategy that doesn't just deal with mandates, but deals with the longer term issues in relation to workplace health and safety across all government departments. And that's why we're looking at a Safer Together campaign in terms of this process. So ensuring that we are able to what we're looking at in terms of that process is thinking through what we're able to do in terms of making workplaces stronger. And in terms of that process, what we are wanting to try and think through is how as a union can we make our workplaces as strong as possible during a very difficult set of circumstances. So in terms of that is about forcing real consultation from the employer, but also to try and make sure that the issue of mandate doesn't become divisive within workplaces, particularly with vaccinations where they're not mandated. We're going to have workers sitting next to each other, some vaccinated, some not, and we're very concerned to make sure that doesn't result in undue conflict within the workplace. We know that mental health is going to be a significant issue for all workers moving forward. The challenges of us dealing with a surge in COVID is going to affect us all in our mental health space. And in terms of that, we know that's going to come. We're at donut day, 0 cases. We're going to get more than that moving forward, whether it's 10, 50, 100, 500. It's going to be challenging for everybody in that space. So we think as a union office, what we've suggested and what we're keen to get interest from members is, do you think there is a role for the union in terms of trying to bring workers together rather than be divided during this process, but also to try and make sure that we can bring workers together in a process around a Safer Together campaign that drives real consultation about the choices that will happen. So not just mandates, but issues around what happens if there's one case in a government department. What does that mean if it's a mixed government building? When do mask mandates come back, if ever? When do lockdowns happen? When do we shift the debate about working from home rather than working from the office, depending on what that looks like? So from my perspective, I think that in terms of this process, if we are going to try and deal with as well as we can in terms of the challenges of COVID, they are inevitable in my view. We are going to face that. But I think every time we have a situation that's facing the public service, we are stronger together. And when workers come together as union members and engage with the employer, we are in a much better position to force meaningful change, to have proper consultation. But that will only happen if we don't end up being divided. And I think while we are going to continue to see the issue of vaccinations becoming more challenging in the mental health space during a surge process, but also during a federal election, it's likely to be weaponised by all sides of politics. What I'm keen to think about from that process is trying to develop up a process within the union that makes our workplaces stronger. And I think what we're seeing today in terms of that poll process is that we have got strong support for that. So in terms of that process, with kind of a reasonable level of support for a Stronger Together campaign, what we'll be looking at doing is developing a website and trying to launch it before Christmas if we can get that organised, but also then developing up a structure of the website to improve the union communication. So rather than just doing it through emails, but also trying to set up some sort of blog process within that website is a better way of communicating what is a very fast-moving exercise, but also to be able to share information across agencies. So I know that's gone a little bit longer than we normally would try to with today's presentation, but we did have quite a lot to get through. In terms of this process, what we know is that COVID is going to come into public sector workplaces. There is going to be a conversation about mandating in public sector workplaces. We will ballot our members to make sure that you have got a strong voice in this process, but we'll also try and force the employer to match our timeframes to make sure that there is meaningful consultation rather than rush consultation. And secondly, we'll then be working through a longer-term workplace health and safety strategy through the Safer Together campaign to make sure that after the mandate conversation has happened, either way, that's not the end of the conversation with your employer, that you'll continue to be able to have strong discussions around what steps you think it is necessary to keep yourself safe, to keep your community safe, and keep your family safe, and then also be able to protect the individuals who rights during this process where mandates are introduced. And finally, to try as far as possible to force the government to act as one on this, rather than having a segmented approach where we have different departments doing different things in relation to how they deal with customer service centres, how they deal with going to First Nation communities, how they deal with mixed workplaces. There are lots of challenges. Up till this point in time, we haven't seen a level of coordination within government that I think is satisfactory, which is why we've taken the steps we have up to this point in time. It's not perfect, but what we do want to do is provide you with a stronger voice, a real capacity to influence decisions, and make sure moving forward we can have a safer workplace as possible, but also one which is united rather than divided. So thanks everybody for taking part today. We weren't able to get through all of the questions on the chat, but we will be doing some follow-up information. But early next week, we would hope to be able to get the website up and running, and certainly encourage people to participate in that campaign, to promote that campaign, because whatever happens, we are in this together. We need to make sure that we are safer together, and then in that process, we are going to be stronger together. Thank you for your time today, and please stay involved and stay in touch. Thank you.